15 years ago, Pastor Joseph adopted 7 unwanted black girls, transforming his home into their sanctuary. As the years pass and the girls build their own lives, Joseph carries a heartbreaking secret that slowly consumes him. But what the girls do to repay him for his selfless kindness will leave him in tears and change everything. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Pastor Joseph sat in his study, the warm glow of his desk lamp casting a soft light across the room. His eyes drifted to a framed photograph on the bookshelf, and a gentle smile touched his lips. The picture showed him with Daniel and Nanita, surrounded by their 7 beautiful daughters. It was taken on a sunny Sunday after church, their faces beaming with joy. Joseph's mind wandered back to those cherished Sundays. He could almost hear the laughter of the girls as they played in the churchyard after service. Daniel and Nanita would always stay behind, helping to tidy up and chatting with Joseph over cups of steaming coffee. "Those were such blessed times," Joseph murmured, his heart full of fondness. He remembered how Daniel's deep, hearty laugh would fill the room, and how Nanita's kind eyes sparkled when she spoke of her daughters. They were more than just members of his congregation. They had become his dearest friends. Joseph's thoughts drifted to their last Sunday together. It was only 2 weeks ago, but it felt like yesterday. Daniel had clapped him on the back after the service, his voice warm with affection. "Another wonderful sermon, Pastor," Daniel had said. "You always know just what to say to lift our spirits." Nanita had nodded in agreement, adding, "We're so blessed to have you in our lives, Joseph. You're like family to us." Those words now echoed in Joseph's mind, bringing a lump to his throat. He blinked back tears, overwhelmed by the depth of their friendship. The shrill ring of the telephone cut through the quiet of the evening, startling Joseph from his reverie. He reached for the receiver, his hand trembling slightly. "Hello?" he answered, his voice soft and uncertain. The words that came through the line hit him like a physical blow. Joseph's face drained of color, and he gripped the edge of his desk to steady himself. "No," he whispered, shaking his head in disbelief. "Oh, dear God, no." The voice on the other end continued speaking, but Joseph could barely hear over the roaring in his ears. Daniel and Nanita, his dear friends, gone in an instant. A car accident, they said. No survivors. Joseph's gaze fell once more on the photograph, his vision blurring with tears. The smiling faces of the 7 girls looked back at him, unaware that their world had just been shattered. "The girls," he choked out. "What about their daughters?" As the person on the phone explained the situation, Joseph's heart broke anew. 7 young lives, suddenly left without parents. 7 precious children, now alone in the world. Joseph's mind reeled, trying to process the enormity of the loss, not just his own grief, but the devastating impact on these innocent girls. He thought of their bright smiles, their infectious laughter, and the love that had always surrounded them. Now, in the blink of an eye, everything had changed. Pastor Joseph sat in the town hall, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his grief. Around him, officials spoke in hushed tones about the future of Daniel and Nanita's daughters. Their words washed over him like a cold, harsh wave. "We'll have to place them in separate foster homes," one of the social workers explained, her voice tinged with regret. "It's nearly impossible to find a family willing to take in 7 children at once." Joseph's heart clenched at the thought. He remembered countless conversations with Daniel and Nanita about the importance of family, how they'd beamed with pride when talking about their girls, always emphasizing how much they loved watching their daughters grow and support each other. "Isn't there any way to keep them together?" Joseph asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The social worker shook her head sadly. "I'm sorry, Pastor. We've explored every option. It's just not feasible." Joseph closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing. He could almost hear Daniel's voice in his head, talking about his girls. "They're stronger together, Joseph. Each one brings something special to our family. I can't imagine them apart." Opening his eyes, Joseph looked at the officials gathered around the table. "Before any decisions are made," he said, his voice growing stronger, "I'd like to see the girls, to make sure they're okay." The social worker nodded, understanding in her eyes. Of course, Pastor. We can arrange that for you. As Joseph left the town hall, his mind was a whirlwind of emotions. The thought of those 7 sweet girls being torn apart from each other was almost too much to bear. He knew he had to see them, to offer what comfort he could in this dark time. Driving to the temporary care facility where the girls were staying, Joseph's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. He prayed silently, asking for guidance and strength. How could he face these children, knowing the heartbreak that lay ahead? Pulling into the parking lot, Joseph took a deep breath. He knew this visit would be difficult, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it was important. Daniel and Nanita had been like family to him, and their daughters deserved all the support he could give. As he walked towards the building, Joseph's mind raced with memories of Sunday picnics, holiday gatherings, and the sound of children's laughter. He couldn't help but wonder what the future held for these girls, and if there was anything more he could do to honor the memory of his dear friends. Joseph stepped into the care facility, his heart heavy with grief and uncertainty. The social worker led him to a small playroom where 7 little girls huddled together, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. The sight of them, so vulnerable and lost, made Joseph's chest tighten with emotion. "Girls," the social worker said gently, "Pastor Joseph is here to see you." 7 pairs of eyes turned to look at him, a mixture of recognition and desperation in their gazes. Joseph knelt down, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. "Hello, girls," he said softly, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I'm so sorry about your mom and dad." The youngest, only 4 years old, began to cry silently. Her older sister, probably 5 or 6, wrapped an arm around her protectively. Joseph's heart broke at the sight. Tamara, the eldest at 7, stepped forward. Her chin quivered, but her eyes were fierce with determination. "Pastor Joseph," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "they want to split us up. They say we can't stay together." Joseph nodded sadly, unable to find the words to comfort her. Tamara's face crumpled, and she threw herself into his arms, sobbing. "Please, please don't let them separate us," she begged, her small body shaking. "We're all we have left. We need each other." The other girls crowded around, clinging to Joseph and their sisters. Their fear was palpable, filling the room with a desperate energy that made it hard to breathe. Joseph held them close, his mind racing. He thought of Daniel and Nanita, of how much they had loved these girls, of how devastated they would be to see their children torn apart. He remembered countless conversations about the importance of family, of sticking together through thick and thin. As he looked at each tear-stained face, Joseph felt something shift inside him. These weren't just his friends' children. They were 7 precious souls who needed love, stability, and each other. The thought of them being separated, sent to different homes with strangers, was unbearable. In that moment, an impossible idea began to take root in Joseph's mind. It was crazy, completely impractical, and would change his life forever. But as he held these trembling, terrified girls in his arms, he knew he couldn't let them go. "What if," he started to say, then paused, almost afraid to voice the thought aloud. The girls looked up at him, hope flickering in their eyes. Joseph took a deep breath and continued, "What if I adopted all of you?" Joseph left the care facility with a newfound determination. His heart raced as he drove to the town hall, rehearsing his arguments in his mind. He knew it wouldn't be easy to convince the authorities, but he had to try. As he entered the building, Joseph took a deep breath, steadying himself for the challenge ahead. He approached the front desk, his voice trembling slightly as he asked to speak with someone about adoption. Soon, Joseph found himself seated across from Mrs. Simpson, the head of the local child services department. Her stern expression made his stomach churn, but he pushed forward. "Mrs. Simpson," Joseph began, "I'm here about the 7 girls who just lost their parents, Daniel and Nanita's children." Mrs. Simpson's eyebrows rose. "Yes, a tragic situation. We're working on finding suitable homes for them." Joseph leaned forward, his voice earnest. "That's why I'm here. I want to adopt them. All of them." The room fell silent. Mrs. Simpson stared at him, her mouth slightly agape. After a moment, she cleared her throat. "Pastor Joseph, I understand you were close to the family, but 7 children? That's an enormous responsibility for anyone, let alone a single man." Joseph nodded, acknowledging her concern. "I know it sounds crazy, but I've thought about this. Those girls need each other, and they need someone who knew their parents, who can keep their memory alive." Mrs. Simpson's expression softened slightly, but she still looked skeptical. "It's not just about love, Pastor. It's about practicality. The financial burden alone would be immense." "I've done the math," Joseph insisted. "I can make it work. I'll take on extra jobs if I have to. These girls are worth it." For the next hour, Joseph laid out his plan. He talked about converting his home's spare rooms into bedrooms, about setting up a routine, about enlisting help from his congregation. With each point, he could see Mrs. Simpson's doubt wavering. "Look," Joseph said finally, his voice thick with emotion, "I know this isn't conventional, but Daniel and Nanita were my dearest friends. They valued family above all else. Splitting up their children would break their hearts. I can't let that happen." Mrs. Simpson sat back in her chair, studying Joseph intently. After what felt like an eternity, she sighed. "Your heart's in the right place, Pastor. But this isn't a decision we can make lightly. We'll need to conduct home visits, financial checks, background checks." "Whatever it takes," Joseph said quickly. "I'll do anything." Over the next few weeks, Joseph's life became a whirlwind of paperwork, interviews, and preparations. He met with social workers, lawyers, and child psychologists. He rearranged his home, bought bunk beds, and stocked up on children's clothes and toys. Finally, after what felt like the longest month of his life, Joseph received the call he'd been waiting for. Mrs. Thompson's voice came through the phone, sounding both impressed and slightly amused. "Well, Pastor Joseph," she said, "I never thought I'd say this, but you've been approved. You can adopt all 7 girls." Joseph's heart raced as he pulled up to his modest home behind the church. 7 pairs of eyes peered out from the van windows, a mixture of curiosity and apprehension evident in their gazes. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the monumental task ahead. "Welcome home, girls," he said softly, opening the van door. The girls filed out one by one, clutching small bags of belongings. Tamara, the eldest, held the hand of 4-year-old Rachel, who was sucking her thumb nervously. Brittany, only a year older than Rachel, clung to her stuffed rabbit, her eyes wide with uncertainty. Joseph led them into the house, watching as they took in their new surroundings. The living room, once a quiet retreat, now seemed small and inadequate for the needs of 7 growing girls. But Joseph had worked tirelessly to make it as welcoming as possible, with colorful throw pillows and a bookshelf stocked with children's stories. "Your rooms are upstairs," Joseph explained, his voice gentle. "I know it's not much, but I hope you'll be comfortable here." As the days passed, Joseph found himself in a whirlwind of activity. Mornings were a chaotic symphony of getting everyone dressed and fed. Nights were filled with bedtime stories and soothing away nightmares. The girls, especially Rachel and Brittany, often cried for their parents, their sobs echoing through the quiet house. One particularly difficult night, Joseph found Rachel huddled in a corner of the living room, tears streaming down her face. He knelt beside her, his heart aching. "I miss Mommy and Daddy," she whimpered. Joseph gathered her in his arms, his own eyes misting over. "I know, sweetheart. I miss them too. But they loved you so much, and they'd want you to be happy." As he comforted Rachel, he noticed Brittany watching from the stairs, clutching her rabbit. He extended his arm, inviting her into the embrace. Soon, all 7 girls had joined them, a tangle of arms and tears and whispered comforts. Despite the challenges, Joseph found moments of joy in their new life together. The church became a second home for the girls, its halls filled with their laughter during Sunday school. The congregation rallied around them, offering support and love. One sunny afternoon, Joseph watched from the church steps as the girls played in the yard. Tamara was pushing Rachel on a swing while Brittany carefully picked flowers to make a crown. The sight filled him with a warmth he couldn't quite describe. "We're going to be okay," he whispered to himself. a small smile tugging at his lips. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but in that moment, Joseph knew that together, they could face anything. As word spread about Joseph's decision to adopt the 7 girls, the small town buzzed with gossip. At the local diner, patrons whispered over steaming cups of coffee. In the grocery store aisles, neighbors exchanged concerned glances and hushed opinions. The church, once a sanctuary of peace for Joseph, became a hotbed of conflicting emotions. After Sunday service, small groups huddled in corners, their voices low, but their gestures animated. Mrs. Willow, a longtime member of the congregation, approached Joseph one afternoon. Her face creased with worry as she spoke. "Pastor, we're all so concerned. How will you manage the church and 7 little ones? It's just not practical." Joseph smiled gently, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "With faith and love, Mrs. Willow, and a lot of help from our community." But not everyone was as direct as Mrs. Willow. Joseph could feel the weight of stares during his sermons, could hear the whispers that quickly died when he entered a room. Some members of the congregation were openly supportive, bringing casseroles and offering to babysit. Others, however, kept their distance, their silence speaking volumes. One evening, as Joseph tucked the girls into bed, he overheard 2 church elders talking outside. "It's admirable, sure," one said, "but what about his duties to the church? We can't have a distracted pastor." Joseph's heart sank, but he pushed the doubt aside. He looked at the sleeping faces of his new daughters and felt a surge of love and determination. The next day, Joseph decided to address the issue head-on. He called a meeting with the church council, his palms sweaty but his resolve firm. "I know there are concerns," he began, his voice steady. "I understand the magnitude of what I've taken on, but these girls need a home, and I believe this is God's plan for me, for us as a community." The room fell silent. Then Mrs. Davis, the oldest member of the council, stood up. "Joseph," she said, her voice quavering with emotion, "what you're doing is a true testament to your faith. We should all be ashamed for doubting you." Her words seemed to break a dam. Slowly, other council members began to nod, some wiping away tears. As Joseph left the meeting, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, but he was more certain than ever that he had made the right choice. The Sunday morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows of the church, casting a warm glow over the congregation. Pastor Joseph stood at the pulpit, his gentle voice carrying through the room as he delivered his sermon. The 7 sisters sat in the front pew, their eyes fixed on their adoptive father. As Joseph concluded his message, he paused and looked out at his flock. "Before we end our service today, does anyone have something they'd like to share?" There was a moment of silence. Then, to everyone's surprise, Tamara slowly rose to her feet. At just 11 years old, she seemed so small standing before the entire congregation. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was clear and strong. "I'd like to say something if that's okay," Tamara said, her eyes meeting Joseph's. Joseph nodded encouragingly, a warm smile on his face. "Of course, Tamara. Go ahead." Tamara took a deep breath and turned to face the congregation. "I want to thank Pastor Joseph for keeping our family together," she began, her voice growing steadier with each word. "When our parents died, we were so scared. We thought we'd be split up and never see each other again." She paused, glancing at her sisters who sat wide-eyed beside her. But Pastor Joseph didn't let that happen. He took all 7 of us in, even though it wasn't easy. He's given us a home and kept us together, just like our parents would have wanted. Tears began to well up in Tamara's eyes, but she blinked them back. "It means so much to me and my sisters. We know it's been hard, and we've heard people talking, but Pastor Joseph has shown us what it means to have faith and to love unconditionally." As Tamara spoke, a hush fell over the church. People leaned forward in their pews, hanging on her every word. Mrs. Willow dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, while Mr. Thompson, who had been one of the most vocal critics, looked down at his hands, his face flushed with shame. "We just want everyone to know how grateful we are," Tamara continued, her voice thick with emotion. "Pastor Joseph isn't just our guardian. He's become our father, and we love him so much." With those words, Tamara's composure finally broke. Tears streamed down her face as she rushed back to her seat, burying her face in Joseph's chest as he wrapped his arms around her. The church was silent for a moment, then erupted into applause. People stood up, clapping and wiping away tears. The atmosphere in the room had shifted, filled with a newfound warmth and understanding. In the weeks following Tamara's heartfelt speech, Joseph noticed a shift in the community's attitude. Where once there had been whispers and doubtful glances, now there were warm smiles and offers of help. Mrs. Willow from down the street began bringing over homemade casseroles every Tuesday, while Mr. Thompson offered to mow the church lawn, freeing up some of Joseph's time. The change wasn't just in the community, though. Joseph felt it within the walls of their home, too. The girls, who had been understandably withdrawn and quiet in the beginning, were starting to open up more. Laughter echoed through the house more often, and the sound filled Joseph's heart with joy. One evening, as Joseph was helping 6-year-old Rachel with her homework, she looked up at him with her big brown eyes. "Can I ask you something?" she said, her voice small but curious. "Of course, sweetheart," Joseph replied, setting down the pencil he'd been holding. Rachel fidgeted with the corner of her workbook. "Is it okay if we call you Dad?" Joseph felt his breath catch in his throat. He hadn't expected this, not so soon. "Oh, Rachel," he said softly, "if that's what you'd like, I'd be honored." A bright smile spread across Rachel's face. "Really? Because Tamara said we should ask you first." Joseph chuckled, his eyes misty. "Tamara's a wise girl, and yes, really, I may not be your birth father, but I love you all as if you were my own." From that day on, Pastor Joseph became simply Dad within the walls of their home. The first time Brittany, the youngest at 4 years old, called out, "Daddy," when she skinned her knee, Joseph's heart swelled with love and pride. There were still challenges, of course. Bedtime for 7 girls was often a chaotic affair, and Joseph sometimes felt overwhelmed by the sheer amount of laundry and dishes that piled up. But in those moments, he would think of Daniel and Nanita, remembering their love for their daughters and the trust they had placed in him. One night, as Joseph tucked the girls into bed, he paused in the doorway, looking back at the room filled with bunk beds and stuffed animals. He felt a deep sense of peace wash over him. This was more than just honoring his friends' wishes. It was about love, family, and the beautiful life they were building together. Years passed like leaves turning in the wind, and Joseph found himself marveling at how quickly his daughters had grown. The once tiny girls who had clung to him for comfort were now vibrant teenagers, each blossoming into her own unique person. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, Joseph sat in his favorite armchair, watching the girls through the window as they played in the churchyard. His heart swelled with pride, but a twinge of worry crept in too. Tamara, now 18, stood tall and confident, organizing a game for her younger sisters. Her drive and ambition shone through in everything she did, from her excellent grades to her role as student body president. Joseph could see her future stretching out bright before her, filled with possibilities. "She's so much like her mother," Joseph murmured to himself, remembering Nanita's determination and strength. His gaze shifted to Brittany, the youngest at 15. She sat apart from the others, sketchbook in hand, her pencil moving swiftly across the page. Her artistic talent had blossomed over the years, and her thoughtful nature often reminded Joseph of Daniel's quiet wisdom. As he watched his daughters, a familiar worry gnawed at Joseph's heart. Had he done enough? Had he prepared them for the challenges that lay ahead in the world beyond their small town? He thought of the many late nights helping with homework, the countless conversations about life and faith, the tears he'd wiped away, and the triumphs he'd celebrated. But was it enough? Joseph sighed, running a hand through his now graying hair. The weight of responsibility still felt heavy at times, even after all these years. He wanted so much for his girls, for them to be happy, successful, and kind. But most of all, he wanted them to be ready for whatever life might throw their way. "Lord," he whispered, closing his eyes, "guide them and protect them. Help me to be the father they need." As if in answer to his prayer, he heard the back door open and the sound of laughter spill into the house. Tamara's voice rang out, "Dad, come join us." Joseph smiled, pushing himself up from his chair. Whatever the future held, they would face it together, as a family. And in that moment, he felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, he had done enough after all. As the girls entered their final years of high school, the topic of college began to dominate conversations in Joseph's household. The pastor watched with a mixture of pride and anxiety as his daughters excitedly discussed their dreams and aspirations. One evening after dinner, Joseph sat at the kitchen table surrounded by a sea of college brochures and financial aid forms. He rubbed his temples, trying to make sense of the numbers before him. The cost of sending 7 girls to college seemed astronomical, far beyond what his modest pastor's salary could cover. Tamara, ever observant, noticed her father's furrowed brow. She approached him quietly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Dad, are you okay?" Joseph looked up, forcing a smile. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just trying to figure out some numbers." Tamara's eyes scanned the papers on the table and understanding dawned on her face. "It's about college, isn't it? Dad, we don't have to go if it's too much. We can find other ways." "No," Joseph interrupted gently but firmly. "Your education is important. Your mother and father, Daniel and Nanita, they would have wanted this for you. We'll make it work." As the weeks passed, Joseph threw himself into researching scholarships, grants, and part-time job opportunities for the girls. He picked up extra speaking engagements at neighboring churches and started offering counseling sessions in the evenings to bring in additional income. The girls noticed their father's efforts and were deeply moved. They began to chip in however they could, babysitting, tutoring younger kids, and even selling handmade crafts at the local farmers market. One by one, the girls started submitting their college applications. Tamara, with her excellent grades and leadership experience, applied to several prestigious universities. Brittany, the artist of the family, set her sights on art schools with strong fine arts programs. The other girls each chose paths that suited their individual interests and strengths. As the acceptance letters began to arrive, Joseph felt a mix of emotions. He was overjoyed at his daughter's successes, but couldn't shake the nagging worry about finances. Late one night, as he pored over his bank statements, he realized that even with his extra work and careful budgeting, he would need to dip into his modest savings to make their college dreams a reality. Joseph closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He thought of Daniel and Nanita, of the promise he had made to give their daughters the best life possible. Opening his eyes, he looked at the framed photo of all 7 girls on his desk and made a silent vow. "We'll make it work," he whispered, echoing the words he had said to Tamara. "Whatever it takes." As the spring sun warmed the small town, an envelope arrived at Joseph's house bearing the seal of a prestigious law school. Tamara, her hands trembling, opened it and let out a joyous cry. "I got in!" she exclaimed, her eyes brimming with tears of happiness. Joseph's heart swelled with pride. He embraced his eldest daughter, feeling the weight of the moment. "I'm so proud of you, Tamara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've worked so hard for this." The news spread quickly through the household, and soon all the sisters were gathered around, hugging Tamara and chattering excitedly about her future as a lawyer. Joseph stood back, watching the scene with a bittersweet smile. He was overjoyed at Tamara's success, but a small part of him ached at the thought of her leaving. In the weeks that followed, Tamara busied herself with preparations for her move to the city. Joseph helped her pack, carefully folding her clothes and wrapping framed family photos in bubble wrap. As they worked, he found himself lost in memories of the little girl who had first come into his care all those years ago. "You know," Tamara said softly, noticing her father's pensive expression, "I couldn't have done this without you, Dad. You've given us everything." Joseph's eyes misted over. "You've earned this, Tamara. Your parents would be so proud of you." As the day of Tamara's departure drew near, Joseph found himself struggling with conflicting emotions. He was excited for her new adventure, but couldn't help feeling a sense of loss. The house would be different without her steady presence, her role as the eldest sister and his right hand in caring for the younger girls. The night before Tamara was set to leave, the family gathered for a special dinner. Joseph had cooked all of Tamara's favorite dishes, and the table was filled with laughter and chatter. Yet, beneath the joy, there was an undercurrent of sadness. After dinner, Tamara found Joseph sitting on the porch swing, gazing at the stars. She sat beside him, leaning her head on his shoulder like she used to do as a child. "I'll visit often, Dad," she promised, her voice soft in the quiet night. "Every chance I get, and I'll call all the time." Joseph wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "I know you will, sweetheart, but things will be different, and that's okay. It's part of growing up." Tamara nodded, feeling a lump in her throat. "I'm going to miss you all so much." "We'll miss you too," Joseph said, his voice thick with emotion. "But we're so proud of you, Tamara. You're going to do amazing things." As the years passed, Joseph watched with a mixture of pride and sadness as his daughters, one by one, spread their wings and left the nest. Each acceptance letter brought joy and celebration, but also a bittersweet reminder that his little family was growing up and moving on. Rachel, always the practical one, was accepted into medical school. Her determination to become a doctor had never wavered, and Joseph couldn't help but beam with pride as she packed her textbooks and stethoscope. "You'll be an amazing doctor, Rachel," he told her, his voice filled with emotion. "You've always had a gift for healing." Brittany, with her gentle spirit and love for children, chose to pursue a degree in art education. Joseph remembered how she used to gather her younger sisters in play school, patiently teaching them their ABCs. "You'll touch so many lives, Brittany," he said, helping her hang up her graduation gown. "Just like you've touched ours." The other girls followed suit, each finding their own path. Some ventured into the world of business, while others pursued their passions in the arts. With each departure, Joseph felt a piece of his heart go with them. As the house grew quieter, Joseph found himself wandering through the empty rooms, memories echoing in every corner. The kitchen, once filled with the chaos of 7 growing girls fighting over breakfast, now stood silent in the mornings. The living room, where they had spent countless evenings laughing and sharing stories, felt cavernous without their presence. One evening, after saying goodbye to his youngest as she left for college, Joseph sat alone on the porch swing. The weight of the silence pressed down on him, and he felt a deep ache in his chest. He was immensely proud of his daughters and the women they had become, but he couldn't help feeling a profound sense of loss. He thought back to the day he had brought them home, 7 scared little girls clinging to each other. Now they were strong, independent women, ready to take on the world. Joseph knew this was what he had always wanted for them, but he hadn't been prepared for the loneliness that came with their success. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the yard, Joseph closed his eyes and said a silent prayer of gratitude for the years he had been blessed with. He knew that even though his daughters were scattered across the country pursuing their dreams, the love that bound their family together would never fade. Joseph's life settled into a new rhythm, one marked by quiet mornings and long-distance phone calls. He poured his love and support into care packages, filling them with homemade cookies, encouraging notes, and little reminders of home. Each box was carefully packed with the same tenderness he had shown when bandaging scraped knees or soothing hurt feelings years ago. As the girls progressed through their studies, Joseph made it his mission to attend every graduation, no matter how far he had to travel. He sat in auditoriums across the country, his heart swelling with pride as each daughter crossed the stage to receive her diploma. But amidst the joy, a nagging feeling of disconnection began to creep in. The phone calls, once filled with excited chatter and shared stories, grew shorter and less frequent. Joseph found himself struggling to keep up with the fast-paced lives his daughters were leading. They spoke of new friends, challenging classes, and budding romances, a world that seemed increasingly distant from the simple life he led back home. One evening, after a particularly brief call with Rachel, Joseph sat in his favorite armchair, feeling the weight of his solitude. He glanced at the family photos lining the walls, frozen moments of a time when he was the center of their world. Now it felt as if he was watching their lives from the sidelines, no longer the first person they turned to for advice or comfort. He thought back to the countless nights he had spent helping with homework, the family dinners filled with laughter, and the quiet moments of shared understanding. Those memories seemed to belong to another lifetime now. Joseph wondered if the bond they had forged through those difficult early years was slowly unraveling, stretched thin by distance and time. As he prepared for bed that night, Joseph's eyes fell on a framed photo of all 7 girls on the day of Tamara's high school graduation. Their smiles were radiant, full of hope and promise for the future. He had given them wings to fly just as he had always intended, but in doing so, had he inadvertently pushed them out of his own life? Joseph's heart ached with a mixture of pride and longing. He was immensely grateful for the amazing women his daughters had become, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing something precious. The close-knit family they had once been seemed to be slipping away, replaced by occasional visits and polite phone calls. Tamara sat at her desk, surrounded by towering stacks of legal documents and case files. The soft glow of her desk lamp illuminated her tired face as she pored over yet another deposition. Her eyes burned from hours of reading, but she couldn't stop. This case was too important. The racial discrimination lawsuit she was working on as part of her law school clinic had consumed her thoughts for weeks. It was a complex case involving a young black man who had been unfairly passed over for promotions at his workplace. The more Tamara dug into the details, the more her heart ached for the injustice she uncovered. She rubbed her temples, trying to ease the tension headache that had become her constant companion. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders. This wasn't just about getting a good grade anymore. A real person's life and future hung in the balance. As she reached for her coffee mug, her hand brushed against a framed photo of her family. There was Pastor Joseph, surrounded by all 7 sisters, his kind eyes radiating pride. Tamara's throat tightened as she looked at his face. How could she tell him that she was starting to doubt her chosen path? Law school had always been her dream, a way to make a difference in the world and make Joseph proud. But now, faced with the harsh realities of the legal system, Tamara felt overwhelmed and unprepared. The emotional toll of fighting against deep-rooted prejudices was draining her spirit. She picked up her phone, her finger hovering over Pastor Joseph's number. She longed to hear his reassuring voice, to confide in him about her struggles. But something held her back. The thought of disappointing him, of admitting that she might have made a mistake, was too much to bear. Tamara set the phone down with a sigh. She couldn't burden Joseph with her doubts. He had sacrificed so much for her and her sisters. The least she could do was push through and make him proud. As she turned back to her work, Tamara felt a familiar knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. She was used to being the strong one, the eldest sister who had it all figured out. But now, she felt lost and unsure. The words on the page before her blurred as tears threatened to spill over. Tamara blinked them back, determined not to give in to her emotions. She had to be strong, had to prove that she could handle this, even if it meant facing her doubts alone. Brittany stood in front of her classroom, her heart racing as she tried to focus on the lesson plan. The colorful alphabet charts and student artwork that usually brought her joy now seemed to blur together. She blinked hard, trying to clear her vision, but the dizziness persisted. "Ms. Brittany, are you okay?" A small voice piped up from the front row. Brittany forced a smile, not wanting to alarm her students. "I'm fine, sweetie. Let's get back to our math problems." But as she turned to write on the whiteboard, a sharp pain shot through her head. The marker slipped from her fingers, clattering to the floor. The room began to spin, and Brittany gripped the edge of her desk to steady herself. I need to sit down for a moment," she managed to say, before collapsing into her chair. The next few hours passed in a blur of concerned colleagues, paramedics, and finally, a hospital room. Brittany lay in the sterile bed, staring at the ceiling as the doctor explained her condition. The words, stress-induced hypertension and need for immediate rest, echoed in her mind. As she was discharged with strict orders to take a leave of absence from work, Brittany felt a deep sense of failure washing over her. She had always prided herself on her dedication to her students, on following in Pastor Joseph's footsteps by nurturing young minds. Now, her body had betrayed her, forcing her to step away from the classroom she loved. Back in her small apartment, Brittany curled up on the couch, hugging a pillow to her chest. She glanced at her phone, seeing several missed calls from Pastor Joseph. Her finger hovered over the callback button, but she couldn't bring herself to press it. What would she say to him? How could she explain that she wasn't strong enough to handle the pressures of teaching? Joseph had sacrificed so much to give her and her sisters a chance at a good life. The thought of disappointing him was unbearable. Brittany's mind wandered to her students, imagining them confused and worried about her sudden absence. She had always believed that teaching was her calling, her way of making a difference in the world. But now, doubt crept in like a shadow. Was this really the right path for her? If she couldn't handle the stress of teaching, was she letting down not just Joseph, but herself and her students too? Tears welled up in Brittany's eyes as she grappled with these questions. She wanted nothing more than to call Joseph, to hear his comforting voice and wise advice. But the fear of burdening him with her problems held her back. Joseph sat in his quiet living room, staring at the phone in his hand. He had just finished another call with Brittany, and like the others before it, something felt off. Her voice was strained, her usual cheerfulness replaced by a forced lightness that didn't quite ring true. "Everything's fine, Dad," she had said. "Just busy with work. You know how it is." But Joseph did know, and he knew it wasn't fine. He could feel it in his gut, the same way he had felt it during his conversations with Tamara and the other girls. They were all hiding something, carrying burdens they wouldn't share. He sighed heavily, rubbing his temples as a familiar ache began to throb behind his eyes. The headaches had been getting worse lately, along with the fatigue that seemed to seep into his bones. But Joseph pushed those thoughts aside. His girls needed him to be strong. Rising from his chair, Joseph winced as a sharp pain shot through his lower back. He steadied himself against the wall, waiting for the discomfort to pass. Once it subsided, he made his way to the kitchen to brew a cup of tea, hoping it might ease his symptoms. As the kettle whistled, Joseph's mind wandered to each of his daughters. Tamara, usually so confident and talkative, had been oddly reticent about her law school experiences lately. Rachel's calls had become shorter and less frequent. Even the younger girls seemed distant, their text messages brief and lacking their usual enthusiasm. Joseph poured the hot water over his teabag, watching the steam rise. He longed to gather all his girls around him like he used to coax out their troubles and offer comfort. But they were grown now, scattered across the country, facing challenges he couldn't see or fully understand. He took a sip of tea, grimacing as another wave of pain washed over him. The doctor had suggested more tests, hinted at the possibility of something serious, but Joseph had brushed it off, unwilling to burden his daughters with his own problems when they clearly had enough of their own. As he stood there in the kitchen, surrounded by the echoes of laughter and chaos that once filled the house, Joseph felt a deep sense of helplessness. He had always been the rock, the steady presence his girls could rely on. Now it seemed they were drifting away and he didn't know how to reach them. Joseph closed his eyes, offering a silent prayer for guidance. He needed to find a way to bridge the growing gap between him and his daughters, to remind them that no matter how old they were or how far they roamed, they would always be his little girls, and he would always be there for them, ready to listen and help, if only they would let him. 10 years had passed, and Joseph's once bustling home had grown quiet. The girls, now accomplished professionals, had all settled in the bustling metropolis a few hours away. Their visits, once frequent and filled with laughter, had become shorter and more infrequent as the years went by. Joseph stood at the window, watching as Rachel's car pulled out of the driveway. She had only stayed for a quick lunch this time, citing a busy schedule and a long drive back to the city. He waved until the car disappeared around the corner, then let his hand fall to his side with a heavy sigh. The house felt emptier than ever. Joseph wandered from room to room, touching photo frames and mementos that reminded him of happier, noisier times. In the kitchen, he paused by the refrigerator, covered in old drawings and report cards. His fingers traced the edges of a faded crayon picture Brittany had drawn when she was just 6 years old. "Where did the time go?" he murmured to himself, a lump forming in his throat. Joseph tried to keep himself busy, throwing himself into his pastoral duties and community work. But in the quiet moments, the loneliness crept in, a constant ache in his chest. He missed the chaos of raising 7 girls, the late-night talks, the proud moments at school events, and even the arguments and tears. When the phone rang, Joseph's heart would leap with hope. But more often than not, the conversations were brief, the girls always in a rush or distracted by something in the background. "Sorry, Dad, I've got a big meeting coming up," Tamara would say, her voice tinged with stress. "I'll try to visit next month, okay?" Brittany would promise, but next month would come and go without a visit. Joseph tried not to let it bother him. He understood that his girls had busy lives, important careers, and their own families to think about now. He was proud of them, of course. They had grown into strong, independent women, just as he had hoped they would. But on quiet Sunday afternoons when the church was empty and the house echoed with memories, Joseph couldn't help but feel the weight of his solitude. He would sit in his favorite armchair, surrounded by family photos, and close his eyes, remembering the days when tiny feet pattered through the halls and giggles filled every corner of the house. Tamara had decided to surprise Joseph with an impromptu visit. She pulled up to the church, her heart warm with anticipation of seeing her adoptive father. As she approached the building, she noticed unfamiliar cars in the parking lot. Curious, she quietly entered through the side door, intending to surprise Joseph in his office. As she neared the meeting room, hushed voices caught her attention. She paused, recognizing the stern tone of Mr. Thompson, the head of the church board. "Pastor Joseph, we can't keep ignoring this," Mr. Thompson said, his voice heavy with concern. "The church's debts are overwhelming. We've explored every option." Tamara's breath caught in her throat. "Debts? What debts?" A gruff voice she didn't recognize chimed in. "I'm sorry, but demolition is the most cost-effective solution. We can sell the land and clear the debts." Tamara's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. Demolish the church? Her childhood home? Joseph's weary voice finally spoke up. "I understand, but surely there must be another way. This church means everything to our community." "Joseph, you've done all you could," Mr. Thompson said gently, "but you can't keep shouldering this burden alone. It's time to face reality." Tamara's mind raced. How long had Joseph been dealing with this? Why hadn't he told them? She backed away from the door, her legs shaky. She needed to think, to process this information. As quietly as she had entered, Tamara slipped out of the church and hurried to her car. Once inside, she pulled out her phone with trembling hands. She created a group chat with all her sisters and typed out a message. "Emergency, Dad's in trouble. Church might be demolished. He never told us. Call me ASAP." Tamara stared at the sent message, her heart pounding. How could Joseph have kept this from them? They were a family. They were supposed to face challenges together. Her phone buzzed as replies from her sisters started pouring in. Confusion, shock, and concern filled the chat. Tamara took a deep breath, knowing she needed to be the strong one, just like she had always been. She dialed Rachel's number, the sister she was closest to. As soon as Rachel picked it up, Tamara's compasuri cracked. "Rachel," she said, her voice breaking, "we need to do something. We can't let Dad lose the church. It's our home." Within hours of Tamara's message, the 7 sisters converged on their childhood home. They arrived in a flurry of worried faces and rapid-fire questions, their cars lining up in front of the modest church that had been their sanctuary for so many years. Joseph was startled by their sudden appearance, his weathered face a mix of confusion and concern as they burst into his office. "Girls, what's wrong? Is everyone all right?" Tamara stepped forward, her eyes brimming with tears. "Dad, we know about the church. Why didn't you tell us?" Joseph's shoulders sagged, the weight of his secret finally lifted. He sank into his chair, looking older than they'd ever seen him. I didn't want to worry you." You've all worked so hard to build your lives. This was my burden to bear." Rachel, always the most empathetic, moved to Joseph's side. "Dad, we're family. Your burdens are our burdens too." Brittany nodded, her voice soft but firm. "You've always been there for us. Let us be there for you now." Joseph looked at each of his daughters, his eyes misting over. "I'm so proud of all of you. I didn't want to hold you back or ask for help when you've already given me so much." The girls exchanged glances, their hearts aching at Joseph's selflessness. They had been so caught up in their own lives, they hadn't noticed the struggles of the man who had sacrificed everything for them. "Dad," Tamara said, her voice steady despite her tears, "you've never held us back. You've only ever lifted us up. Now it's our turn to do the same for you." The other sisters murmured in agreement, moving closer to Joseph, surrounding him with love and support. "We're going to fix this," Rachel declared, her medical training kicking in as she assessed the situation. "First, we need to understand the full extent of the problem." Joseph hesitated, then slowly began to explain the church's financial troubles. As he spoke, the girls listened intently, their minds already working on solutions. "We can do this," Brittany said, her teacher's optimism shining through. "Together, we can save our church." The atmosphere in the room shifted from despair to determination. The 7 girls, now accomplished women, stood united, ready to tackle the challenge head-on. Joseph looked at his daughters, overwhelmed by their love and support. He realized that in trying to protect them, he had underestimated their strength and their bond as a family. "I don't know what to say," Joseph said, his voice thick with emotion. "You girls are truly a blessing." Tamara squeezed his hand. "You taught us the importance of family and community, Dad. Now it's time we put those lessons into action." As the girls began to brainstorm ideas, Joseph watched them with pride and gratitude. He had raised them to be strong, compassionate women, and now they were using those qualities to save the very place that had brought them together. The sisters gathered around the old kitchen table, their childhood home now a war room for saving the church. Tamara, with her legal pad in hand, took charge of the meeting. "All right, let's break this down," she said, her voice steady and determined. "We need to tackle this from multiple angles." Rachel, the doctor, nodded. "I can reach out to my colleagues at the hospital. Maybe we can organize a charity run or something similar." Brittany's eyes lit up. "That's a great idea. I can get my students involved too. They're always looking for community service projects." As the sisters brainstormed, Joseph watched from the doorway, his heart swelling with pride. He couldn't help but marvel at how his girls had grown into such capable, compassionate women. Tamara scribbled furiously on her pad. "Okay, here's what we've got so far. Rachel's organizing a charity run. Brittany's rallying her students. Sarah's reaching out to local businesses for sponsorships. And Emily's designing promotional materials." "What about you, Tamara?" Joseph asked softly. Tamara looked up, her eyes filled with determination. "I'm going to review all the legal documents, Dad. There might be some loopholes or options we haven't considered yet. I'll also negotiate with the bank to see if we can restructure the debt." Joseph felt a lump in his throat. "Girls, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything, Dad," Rachel said, giving him a warm smile. "We're family. This is what families do." Over the next few weeks, the sisters threw themselves into their plan with unwavering dedication. Tamara spent long nights poring over financial documents and legal papers, searching for any way to alleviate the church's debt burden. She made countless phone calls, negotiating tirelessly with bank representatives and potential donors. Meanwhile, Rachel's charity run idea took off. She rallied her medical colleagues and patients, spreading the word throughout the hospital and beyond. Brittany's students embraced the cause wholeheartedly, organizing bake sales and car washes to contribute their share. Sarah's business acumen proved invaluable, as she secured sponsorships from local companies, each eager to support the beloved community church. Emily's artistic talents shone through in the eye-catching posters and flyers that soon adorned every storefront in town. The entire community began to buzz with excitement as the day of the big fundraiser approached. Joseph watched in awe as his daughters transformed the church grounds into a festival of hope and unity. On the morning of the event, Joseph stood at the church steps, overwhelmed by the sight before him. Hundreds of people had gathered, all there to support the place that had been a cornerstone of their community for generations. As the sisters worked tirelessly to save the church, moments of nostalgia began to creep into their conversations. One evening, as they sat around the old kitchen table reviewing their progress, Brittany's eyes fell on a faded crayon drawing pinned to the refrigerator. "Hey, look at this," she said softly, walking over to examine it closer. "I remember making this for Dad when I was 6. The other sisters gathered around, smiling at the childish scrawl of 7 stick figures holding hands with a taller one labeled Daddy. Rachel's eyes misted over. "I can't believe he kept this all these years." "He kept everything," Sarah added, her voice thick with emotion. "Remember how he used to come to every single one of our school events, even when they overlapped?" Tamara nodded, a lump forming in her throat. He'd rush from one to the other, always making sure each of us saw him in the audience. As they continued working, more memories surfaced. Emily recalled how Joseph had learned to braid hair just for them, his large hands fumbling with the delicate strands until he got it right. "And remember when he took on that second job at the grocery store?" Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He never told us, but I overheard him talking to Mrs. Johnson about needing extra money for our school supplies." The sisters fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts about the countless sacrifices their father had made. They remembered the nights he'd stayed up late helping with homework, the way he'd stretched his modest pastor's salary to make sure they never went without, and how he'd always put their needs before his own. Tamara, usually so composed, felt tears welling up in her eyes. "We were so caught up in our own lives, we didn't see how much he was struggling with the church finances." "He never wanted to burden us," Sarah said softly. "Even now he's trying to protect us." The realization hit them all at once, the depth of Joseph's love and sacrifice. It wasn't just about keeping them together after their parents died. It was about giving them a future, even at the cost of his own dreams and comfort. Brittany stood up, her voice filled with determination. "We have to make this work, not just for the church but for Dad. He gave up everything for us. Now it's our turn to give back." The others nodded in agreement, a new fire ignited in their hearts. They understood now that saving the church wasn't just about preserving a building or a community landmark. It was about honoring the man who had given them everything, who had kept them together when the world wanted to tear them apart. With renewed vigor, they threw themselves back into their work. Each sister was more determined than ever to ensure their father's legacy would stand strong, just as he had stood strong for them all these years. One evening, as Joseph sat in his favorite armchair, lost in thought about the church's future, he heard a commotion at the front door. Curious, he stood up, his joints creaking slightly as he made his way to investigate. To his surprise, all 7 of his daughters burst into the living room, their faces beaming with excitement. Tamara, the eldest, held a large, beautifully wrapped package in her arms. "Dad!" they chorused, surrounding him with hugs and kisses. Joseph's eyes widened, a smile spreading across his weathered face. "What's all this about?" he asked, his voice filled with warmth and confusion. Rachel, her eyes twinkling, guided him back to his chair. "We have a surprise for you, Dad," she said softly. As Joseph settled into his seat, the girls gathered around him, their faces glowing with anticipation. Tamara stepped forward and carefully placed the package in his lap. "Open it, Dad," Brittany urged, her voice barely containing her excitement. With trembling hands, Joseph unwrapped the gift. As the paper fell away, he found himself holding a large leather-bound book. The cover was embossed with golden letters that read, "Our Family Journey." "It's a scrapbook," Sarah explained, her voice gentle. "We've been working on it for years." Joseph opened the book and his breath caught in his throat. The first page held a photo of all 7 girls, huddled together on the steps of the church, taken just days after he had adopted them. Their young faces looked up at the camera, a mixture of uncertainty and hope in their eyes. As he turned the pages, Joseph's eyes filled with tears. There were photos of birthday parties, Christmases, and lazy summer afternoons. He saw snapshots of the girls' first day of school, their graduations, and their proudest achievements. Each page was filled with handwritten notes describing memories and expressing gratitude. "Look, Dad," Emily said, pointing to a particular photo. "Remember when you taught us all how to ride bikes? You ran alongside each of us until we got the hang of it." Joseph nodded, unable to speak as emotions welled up inside him. He remembered those days vividly: the scraped knees, the wobbling handlebars, and the triumphant smiles when they finally managed to pedal on their own. As he continued to flip through the pages, Joseph saw his own face changing over the years. He saw the worry lines that had appeared during tough times, but also the joy that radiated from him as he watched his daughters grow and thrive. The final pages of the book were filled with recent photos, the girls in their professional attire, standing proud in their offices or classrooms. There were pictures of family gatherings, with all of them surrounding Joseph, their faces full of love and respect. On the last page, each daughter had written a personal note to Joseph. As he read their heartfelt words of love and gratitude, tears began to roll down his cheeks. "Oh, my girls," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. I don't know what to say." The sisters surrounded him, enveloping him in a group hug. Joseph held the book close to his chest, overwhelmed by the love and appreciation his daughters had shown him. As the emotional moment with the scrapbook passed, Tamara cleared her throat, her eyes shining with excitement. "Dad, we have more news," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Joseph looked up, wiping away his tears. "More news?" he asked, his voice filled with curiosity. The girls exchanged glances and Rachel stepped forward. "We've been working on something big, Dad," she explained. "Remember when we found out about the church's debt?" Joseph's face fell slightly, the worry lines deepening on his forehead. "Yes, I remember," he said softly. Brittany reached out and took his hand. "Well, we couldn't just stand by and let the church be demolished," she said. "So we came up with a plan." "A plan?" Joseph repeated, his eyes widening. Sarah nodded enthusiastically. "We organized a massive fundraiser, Dad. We reached out to everyone we knew, old friends from town, colleagues, even some of your former congregation members who'd moved away." "And guess what?" Emily chimed in, barely able to contain her excitement. "We did it, Dad. We raised enough money to pay off the church's debt." Joseph's jaw dropped, his eyes filling with tears once again. You did what?" he stammered, unable to believe what he was hearing. Tamara pulled out an envelope from her purse and handed it to Joseph. "It's all here, Dad. The check to clear the church's debt. The demolition has been called off." Joseph's hands shook as he held the envelope, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what his daughters had accomplished. I don't know what to say," he whispered. But the girls weren't finished. Rachel stepped forward again, her voice soft but filled with pride. "There's more, Dad. We've started a foundation in your name, the Joseph Brinton Foundation for Small-Town Churches. The foundation will help support other struggling churches in small communities," Emily explained. "We wanted to make sure your legacy of faith and community service continues, even beyond our town." Joseph looked at each of his daughters, his heart swelling with pride and love. He saw in their faces the same determination and compassion that had driven him to adopt them all those years ago. They had not only saved his church, but had also found a way to help others facing similar struggles. "My girls," Joseph said, his voice thick with emotion, "you've done more than I could have ever imagined. You've not only saved our church, but you're going to help so many others." He paused, overwhelmed by the moment. "I'm so proud of you all. So very proud." The girls gathered around Joseph once again, embracing him tightly. In that moment, Joseph felt a profound sense of peace and joy. He knew that the values he had instilled in his daughters, faith, compassion, and service to others, would live on through them and through the foundation they had created in his name. Joseph stood at the back of the church, his eyes filled with tears of joy as he watched his 7 daughters standing together at the front. The sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting a warm glow over the packed pews. The once struggling church was now bustling with life, filled with familiar faces and new members alike. Tamara, the eldest, stood tall and proud, her law degree hanging in the church office as a testament to her hard work. Rachel, in her white doctor's coat, chatted animatedly with an elderly parishioner. Brittany, with her gentle teacher's smile, helped a young child find a seat. The other girls, each successful in their own right, moved about the church, greeting people and ensuring everything was perfect for the service. Joseph's heart swelled with pride as he observed the scene. It wasn't just the building they had saved. It was the spirit of community and faith that now thrived within these walls. The church buzzed with energy, a far cry from the nearly empty, debt-ridden place it had been just a few years ago. As the girls gathered together, linking arms and sharing quiet laughs, Joseph felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. He remembered the scared, grieving little girls they had once been, and marveled at the strong, compassionate women they had become. In that moment, Joseph realized that his greatest blessing wasn't just the church or his pastoral calling. It was the family he had built, a family born not of blood, but of love, faith, and shared struggles. These 7 women, once orphaned and alone, now stood as pillars of strength and kindness in their community. Tears flowed freely down Joseph's cheeks as he watched his daughters. He knew that long after he was gone, their love, faith, and resilience would continue to touch lives and make a difference. Through them, and through the foundation they had created in his name, his legacy of compassion and service would live on for generations to come. As the organ began to play and the congregation settled into their seats, Joseph's daughters turned and spotted him at the back of the church. Their faces lit up with love, and they beckoned him to join them. With a heart full of joy, Joseph made his way down the aisle, ready to stand proudly beside the family he had built, in the church they had saved together. If you enjoyed the story of Pastor Joseph, Tamara, and her sisters, I hand-picked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.